So we care about nutrients in soils, in part because nutrients in soils affect ecosystems, they affect ecosystem productivity, ecosystem biodiversity, and life on this planet at whole, if you like. From a more practical perspective, or more economic perspective, we also care about nutrients because if we can apply them as fertilizers, we have the potential to increase yield in forest systems, in range systems by increasing the biomass produced, and in crop systems in general. If we were to look at a general trend of how yield responds to fertilizer additions, we may find something along the lines of the blue curve, where as we add fertilizer, we are correcting for a deficiency and we're increasing yield, but after a certain amount of fertilizer added, we do not get any more additional yield benefits. So we would have wasted fertilizer past some optimum point along this curve. And when I say waste fertilizer, I really mean waste in terms of the money it took to buy the fertilizer, a waste in terms of the labor that it took to apply that additional fertilizer, and also the detriment that comes to the environment by that fertilizer, which is not being used to increase yields, has the potential to move off-site, where it can use to eutrophication of lakes and rivers, or in the cases of nitrogen, it also has the potential to be lost due to denitrification, which is harmful to the climate. So we want to avoid wasting fertilizer, and we want to apply just the right amount to correct deficiencies. And really important in the understanding of what to apply when and where is what's called the law of deficiency, which is attributed to Karl Spengel and Justus von Liebig, both German scientists. Karl Spengel lived about 100 years before Justus von Liebig, but it's unclear who exactly is the first one that came up with this. Well, the law of the minimum more or less states that the yield is proportional to the amount of the most limiting nutrient. So whichever nutrient this may be, and from this it may be inferred that if the deficient nutrient is supplied, yields may be improved to the point that some other nutrient is then becoming the limiting one. Okay. So in this particular example here, you see the blue water spilling out of the yield bucket. We would have corrected that particular yield limitation, and if we apply fertilizer to correct for that, then the next limiting fertilizer would be the one that affects yields. So that soil amendments have the potential to increase yield has been known for a long time. And historically, the focus was not so much on increasing yield, but the focus would have been to mitigate for declining yields. So adding something to the soils to make up for what was lost with crop production to maintain yields was the plan for a very, very long time. And the fertilizer du jour was manure or other excrements that could be added to the soil as a source of fertilizer. The other source of fertilizer would have been bones, which are particularly high in phosphates. And in Europe, there's gruesome stories of bones being collected from battlefields and then added to fields as an amendment and producing better yields that way. In about 1802, Alexander von Humboldt, a German polyscientist who's made various contributions to science, traveled extensively throughout South America and discovered that seabird excrements that had accumulated are a particularly good source of nitrogen. And he more or less advocated the use of seabird excrements or guano as a fertilizer source. And by 1940 or so, there was a active mining and distribution of guano as a fertilizer throughout the world. So there was quite a period of time where guano literally ruled the world, and there was more of a gold rush in some sense than the gold rush that was seen here in the US. By about the 1850s or so, the pressure that was exerted on Congress by farmers in particularly the southeast that had seen declining yields in the tobacco and other cotton and crop fields led to the passing of the Guano Act, which allowed the U.S. to claim any unused and unclaimed Pacific island that had guano on it and claim it as its own. So that was sort of the first imperialistic step that the U.S. took on the world stage and claimed about 200 or so Pacific islands that way as guano sources, and then the guano sources became available to U.S. farmers. Sort of the unintended consequences of that sort of played out also in World War II, because that was part of the involvement of the U.S. in the Pacific theater, because it had these 200 islands that had claimed to the Guano Act. By about the 1870s, 1880s, a lot of these guano sources had been mined. There was declining availability of them. There was a lot of politics and war involved in the distribution of guano and the mining of guano as well. And there was the discovery that saltpeter was also a very good source of nitrogen, and then saltpeter took over from guano, and guano became unimportant as a fertilizer source. Well, then in 1909, the Haber-Bosch process came online. So there was the artificial or industrial fixation of nitrogen and making nitrogen fertilizer available in that way. So you see on the right here a graph of how the additional nitrogen through the Haber-Bosch fixation has fueled the yield increases and has also fueled an increase in the human population that otherwise would not have been able to be fed with the sources of nitrogen that were available. So applying fertilizer and correcting for nutrient imbalances or nutrient availability imbalances has benefits. It increases yields, it feeds a hungry population. And in order to do this, one should strive for a balanced fertilization or good nutrient management. And the goals of that may be that it has to be cost effective, and also that it has to be efficient in the use and conserve nutrient resources. It's particularly important for phosphorus because, as we've learned, phosphorus is relatively rare in the continental crust. Therefore, there aren't too many mining resources for it available. Now, in the case of Idaho, that isn't necessarily the case. We have phosphorus mines in southern Idaho, Soda Springs, that are owned by what used to be Monsanto, now Bayer. But you might be surprised to find out that the phosphate that's mined there is actually not used as a phosphorus fertilizer, but it's used in the production of glyphosate. Anyways, the other goals to strive for are to maintain or enhance the soil quality, especially as it regards to long-term productivity. But the fourth and most important point, I guess, for all of us is that the application of nutrients also should strive to protect the environment beyond the individual soil or field, and especially the quality of water above and below ground is important here. So to look at all the effects that an imbalanced fertilization may have, an imbalanced fertilization may come about through neglect, but in most cases it is not neglect or evil will, but in a lot of cases it's either unintended or even despite best efforts, an imbalanced fertilization may occur. So let's look at some examples of fertilizer applications of nitrogen that are in excess of what was needed. As we've learned, nitrogen additions to the soil, not for all sources of nitrogen fertilizer, but for the most commonly used ones, will lead to acidification of soil and all the consequences that brings along with it. We've learned that nitrates are highly mobile, leach out of the system, and can contaminate groundwater. So nitrate is toxic. It's particularly effective on babies. There's the blue baby syndrome that is related to excess nitrates in the groundwater. So contaminating groundwater, especially in states like California, but also here in northern Idaho, is a really big concern. The other things that happen with the application and fabrication of nitrogen fertilizer is that we affect the climate, both through the energy intensiveness of the Haber-Bosch process, but also through the emission of nitrous oxides, which is a greenhouse gas and also facilitates or causes acid rain emissions. The other thing that it does is that especially nitric oxides act as a catalyst to speed up the breakdown of ozone in the atmosphere, so it contributes to ozone depletion. Of a most visual effect, though, is the loss and export into the hydrosphere, where the imbalanced fertilization on a field and the export of these nutrients leads to increased production in a system that was previously limited by the availability of these nutrients. And it's called eutrophication, which is the excessive of nutrients in a lake or other body of water that is free due to runoff from land, which then causes a dense growth of plant life, and eventually the plant life dies, and then under aerobic respiration these waters become depleted of oxygen, and we create dead zones where you have fish die off and so forth. This, of course, happens in lakes, and you see a little image down in the corner of what that looks like, and I'm sure you've seen it all in the lakes in your neighborhood as well. But it also happens in the oceans, and the Gulf of Mexico is quite famous for developing these dead zones every single year. The other thing that happens is that the added or the increased concentration of nitrogen in ocean waters also leads to ocean acidification, which then of course also has consequences for the survival of corals and so forth. So getting the nutrient management right is really important for all of us and for survival on this planet on the whole. So closing the nutrient cycle at the local field scale, if you want, should really be done based on the soil properties and all the things that we've learned throughout this semester. And hopefully all of you have gained a greater appreciation of how complex that really is and how difficult it is to get that right.